She still doesn't suspect anything he whispered down the hall about me, his wife. And I listened, breathless, in the dark. I woke with a start, the side of the bed where Corbin usually slept cold and empty. At first I thought nothing of it. Maybe he went downstairs for water or couldn't sleep. But then I heard it, the sound of his voice, low and deliberate, slicing through the silence like a needle through silk. I sat up slowly, heart hammering. My bare feet touched the cold wooden floor, the chill grounding me as I crept toward the hallway. His voice was just loud enough to catch fragments. She still doesn't suspect anything. I've already transferred it. Almost done. A wave of nausea rolled through me. The breath caught in my throat. Transferred what? Done with what? I pressed myself against the wall, the cool paint biting into my shoulder. His voice wasn't loving, it was calculated. I was listening to a man I didn't recognize. If you've ever woken up next to someone who once promised the world, only to realize they were planning to steal it from you, then you know the fear that crawls under your skin. Tell me, have you ever been betrayed in silence? Leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe to hear what happens when a woman with everything decides she won't lose quietly. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I laid there still as stone, my back to Corbin when he returned to bed. He moved like nothing happened, sliding under the covers, as if the darkness hadn't swallowed his true voice just moments ago. I listened to the steady rhythm of his breath beside me, but every sound felt sinister now. Each exhale a ticking clock. Each inhale a countdown to something I couldn't yet name. At sunrise, while Corbin was still asleep, I slipped out of bed and padded down to the kitchen. The marble countertop felt cool under my palms as I steadied my shaking hands. I opened the banking app, something I hadn't done in years. Corbin always managed the finances, our investments, our properties, the accounts. I trusted him. Or rather, I had trusted him, but now I couldn't afford trust. The screen lit up. My eyes scanned the transactions. And then my stomach dropped. 500, 1,000, 2,000, 7,500. Withdrawals, small but frequent, spread out just enough not to raise flags. But when you line them up, it was a pattern, a quiet siphoning of our wealth. Over 3 months, each dollar gone without discussion. My vision blurred as I blinked hard. These weren't legitimate business transfers. They weren't tied to any properties or projects I recognized. They were vanishing into a void, one entry at a time. Checking the account this early, I jumped. Corbin stood in the doorway, rubbing the back of his neck, his voice thick with fake sleep. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. And when his gaze flicked to my phone, something tightened in his face so fast it almost passed unnoticed. Almost. Just checking a few things, I said calmly, slipping my phone to the side, as if it were nothing more than habit. Some withdrawals looked off. Oh, he said casually, pouring himself coffee, like we were just another couple in just another morning. Just some small investments I forgot to mention. Nothing major. I watched him take a sip. He never met my eyes. He was rehearsed, smooth. But I'd seen behind the curtain now, and I would never unsee it. I see, I murmured. Inside, a fire had started. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was colder than that, more precise. I spent the rest of the day pretending, nodding, smiling, laughing at his tired jokes, playing the part of the wife who still believed she had a husband. But every movement he made I catalogued. The way he took calls outside, voice hushed. How he left his phone screen down even at dinner. How he looked at me with something close to calculation. I watched him the way a soldier watches the horizon, waiting for movement, waiting for the next ambush. And yet I never let on. That was key. Because if he was playing a game, I needed to know every rule before I made my move. That night after he went to bed, I stayed awake in the living room, with nothing but the sound of the city echoing through our high-rise windows. The skyline blinked with red lights and cold neon, but I wasn't looking at the view. I was remembering every withdrawal, every evasion, every lie that once sounded like love. He was planning something, and now? So was I. It happened 3 nights later, a careless moment, a simple oversight, and it gave me everything. Corbin stood from the couch after dinner, stretching lazily like nothing in the world could touch him. "I'm going to shower," he said, heading toward the bedroom. But what he left behind, what he had never once left unattended, was his phone. For the first time in years, it was just there, face down, alone. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. I listened as the water started to run through the pipes. Shower on, steady. A hum behind the walls. My pulse quickened. I reached for the phone, my fingertips trembling. I told myself not to overreact. Just one peek. Just one message. Just the screen lit up. A text preview blinked to life. Send her Iliam Maro. Just make sure she stays in the dark. Almost done. I stopped breathing. Iliam Maro, I didn't know the name, but the way it was written. The way it sounded like a code, a final chess move. It was enough to make my blood freeze. Almost done. That line again. The same phrase I heard the night he whispered in the hallway. Almost done with what? With me. With everything I built, I placed the phone back exactly where it was. My fingers were cold, my throat dry. The hum of the shower felt distant now, like it belonged in another world. One where I hadn't just read a message that changed everything. Back in the living room, I sat with my back straight, my hands folded in my lap like a porcelain doll that had cracked down the middle but refused to break. That night, I didn't sleep. By morning, my decision was clear. While Corbin kissed me goodbye and told me he'd be in back-to-back meetings all day. I nodded like always, smiled, shut the door behind him. Then I called Savannah. Savannah Yu had been my best friend since college. She was also a top-tier corporate attorney, now specializing in asset protection and trust law. When she picked up, my voice was steady but low. I need to protect everything I said. Isolde, she asked gently. What's going on? I don't have time to explain it all. Not yet, but I'm not safe. Not financially. You think Corbin's planning something I don't think, I whispered. I know. I told her everything I could in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. The late-night phone call, the strange withdrawals, the message about Iliam Maro, the staged charm, the silence at dinner that felt like warning signs painted in neon. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then Savannah's voice returned calm and surgical, like steel beneath silk. We'll start a trust. We'll transfer all assets quietly, discreetly, and legally airtight. He won't touch a cent. I blinked. The relief was immediate and terrifying, because if she already had the plan ready, it meant she'd seen this before. Too many times. How fast can we do this? 3 days, she said. You just need to sign what I send. And don't let him know. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Thank you, I said softly. Don't thank me, Savannah replied. You're doing what he never expected. You're fighting back. The moment I hung up, the air in the apartment felt different, sharper, charged. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I wasn't crying in the dark or watching from behind corners. I had taken my first step. A quiet, precise step. And Corbin would never hear it coming. 4 days passed, just long enough for Savannah to finalize the trust transfer, all accounts, and insulate every asset I had down to the last cent. Just long enough for Corbin to believe I was still in the dark. That morning, he came home earlier than usual. He looked rested, confident, his blazer crisp shirt collar open just enough to give him that effortless charm he used like a blade. He set down his briefcase, looked at me across the living room, and said, "We need to have a serious talk." I knew what was coming. "All right," I replied, folding my hands in my lap steady. Corbin sat across from me and placed a neatly clipped stack of documents on the table. Legal papers, divorce papers. His smile was soft, even sympathetic, almost rehearsed. "I think we've grown apart, Isolde," he began. "This doesn't have to be messy. It's better for both of us if we do this now quietly, cleanly." My chest tightened, but not from heartbreak, from the sheer audacity, the ease with which he tried to dismantle our marriage like a business merger. "And you don't want things to get more tense," he added. I tilted my head. Really, for the first time in weeks, there was a flicker in his expression, a crack in his mask. "Yes," he continued quickly. "It's time." I picked up the documents, slowly flipped through them. There it was, his demands, half of everything, including the penthouse, including all joint accounts, even a monthly support payment citing that he had sacrificed his career for our shared life. He must have thought I'd cry, or beg, or plead. Instead, I closed the folder gently and pushed it back across the table and met his eyes. Before we talk about this, there's something you should know. Corbin leaned forward slightly, his brow lifting. What's that? I've already moved all of my assets. Silence. It was brief, but it landed like a bomb. His posture stiffened. His smile faded. What do you mean? He asked, his voice lower now. I mean the apartment, the savings, the investments, the business shares. Everything that was mine is now legally protected under a private trust. You won't get a cent. He stared at me, blinking once. Then again. His fingers curled against the table, slow and deliberate. You can't do that, he said through gritted teeth. Not without I already did. The words sliced through the room with more force than I expected. But I didn't back down. You said you wanted to keep this clean. So here's your clean exit. You walk away, with nothing. He stood suddenly, knocking his chair slightly off balance. His calm was gone. The polished exterior shattered. You think this is over, he hissed. You think you've won? I rose to my feet too slowly. No, Corbin. I don't think anything. I know I've won. Because you underestimated me. His face flushed with anger. His hands trembled at his sides. He wanted to scream, to lash out. But I gave him nothing to hit, nothing to grab. Then I'll see you in court, he said, finally, voice tight. I smiled. Go ahead. He stood there a moment longer, silent. And then, like a man defeated but unwilling to show it, he picked up the folder and stormed out of the room. When the door slammed shut behind him, I exhaled. Not from relief this wasn't over, but from certainty. The game had changed. The balance of power had shifted. And I wasn't the prey anymore. I should have known Corbin wouldn't walk away quietly. Men like him never do. 3 days after our confrontation, the whispers began. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. A few strange glances at the office, the way 2 of my team members paused their conversation when I entered the break room. But by the end of that week, the doubt had a face. Rachel, my assistant, loyal to the core, stepped into my office with her jaw tight and her phone in hand. You need to see this, she said, placing a printed sheet on my desk. It was a screenshot of a post from an anonymous forum. A certain CFO is embezzling funds to hide money from her husband during a divorce. Insider tips start with the firm's secondary investment account. Beneath it, comments. Dozens. And then one that made my blood run cold. I know who it is. Laura at Vance Tech. My name. Twisted into something filthy. Rachel looked at me, eyes filled with concern. They're going to start asking questions, Isolde. This could ruin everything you've built. I stared at the paper, my chest burned. But I didn't panic. Not anymore. Corbin did this, I said flatly. Rachel didn't even blink. Of course he did. I nodded once, rose from my chair, and picked up my phone. I need Savannah. Now. That evening, I sat in Savannah's office, her windows glowing with the Manhattan skyline behind her. I told her everything again. The post, the name, drop, the comments, the calculated cruelty of it all. She listened unmoved, then leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. He's trying character assassination, she said calmly. He wants you to lose your composure. Slip up. Make a public mistake. I won't, I replied, jaw tight. But I won't let him get away with it either. Good, Savannah, said her voice steely. Because now we stop reacting. Now we go on offense. She drafted a cease and desist letter that night. Sent it directly to Corbin's legal team with a warning any further defamatory action would result in an immediate defamation lawsuit. But we both knew that wouldn't be enough. He'd already crossed a line. We needed to prove intent. And fraud. We need to trace the origin of that post, I said. Savannah nodded. Already working on it. But that's not all. She pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Inside were documents from a forensic financial analyst she'd retained since the beginning. He's filed a lawsuit, she said. He's claiming you siphoned money from your joint accounts into the trust illegally. And he's bringing in someone to support the evidence. Who, I asked. My stomach turned before she said it. Iliam Maro, his name just appeared on the filing. There it was. The final move Corbin had been waiting for. The name from the message. The ghost behind the curtain. He's real, I whispered. Oh, he's real, Savannah said. Known for fabricating financial records. Has slipped through legal cracks for years. But this time? She flipped to a page and pointed. We have something they don't. The transactions they submitted had timestamps. sloppy ones. Dated 2 months before the trust account was even opened. My eyes widened. They got cocky, Savannah said. They didn't double-check the metadata, and we can prove it, she nodded. Not only can we prove it, we're going to use it to bury them. That week blurred into a haze of signatures, phone calls, and sworn affidavits. I barely ate, barely slept. My focus sharpened to a single goal: defend what I built. Not just the money, though. Yes, I earned every cent. But the company. My name. My future. Corbin didn't just want half. He wanted to destroy me on the way down. But I wasn't going down. Not quietly. Not ever. 7 days later, Savannah called. I was on the balcony when the phone rang. The lights of the city spread out below me like a circuit board. They made a fatal error, she said, her voice brimming with restrained fire. The accounts show transactions before they existed. It's done, Isolde. They handed us the proof. I didn't speak. Just let the words settle. Let the calm sweep through my chest like a tide. We're not just going to dismiss their claims, Savannah continued. We're filing a countersuit. Defamation, fraud, submission of falsified evidence with intent to harm. I closed my eyes. This wasn't just personal anymore. This was war. And I was ready. The courtroom was cold. Not from the air conditioning, but from the silence. That thick breath-held tension that settles before something shatters. I sat with Savannah at my side, spine straight, palms resting against the table. Across from me, Corbin adjusted his cufflinks, like a man preparing for a board meeting, not a battle for his credibility. His suit was sharp, his expression confident, but I saw the twitch in his jaw, the nervous tap of his foot beneath the table. He was dressed like a winner, but he knew, somewhere deep down, he knew what was coming. The judge entered, a gray-haired man with a heavy brow and eyes that missed nothing. He flipped through the case files, lips pursed in silent assessment. Then he spoke. Mr. Drexler, your complaint alleges that Ms. Vance illegally transferred marital assets to a private trust using falsified withdrawals. Corbin's attorney stood. That's correct, Your Honor. And your evidence, the judge asked. The lawyer moved smoothly, handing over a set of documents. Pages filled with so-called bank records, transaction logs, and date-stamped reports. All supposedly proving that I'd moved funds from our joint account before filing for protection. Savannah remained still. Calm. But I felt the heat radiating from her. The judge read in silence. For a long moment, the only sound in the courtroom was paper turning. Then he set the file down. His gaze shifted to Corbin. These transactions, the judge said slowly, occurred 2 months before the trust account was even opened. Corbin's mouth opened, then closed. A forensic expert verified this timeline, the judge continued. Which means the documents presented here are at best inaccurate, and at worst intentionally fabricated. A quiet gasp echoed from the benches behind us. I turned slightly, just enough to watch the color drain from Corbin's face. He blinked hard, his jaw tightened. But he didn't speak. Furthermore, the judge added, your associate, Mr. Iliam Maro, has a record of involvement in document falsification. This court finds reason to believe the evidence presented was deliberately altered to damage Ms. Vance's reputation. Savannah let out a soft, victorious exhale. I didn't move. I didn't smile. Not yet. Due to these findings, the court dismisses all claims made by Mr. Drexler, the judge said firmly. Ms. Vance's trust remains protected. No assets will be divided. Corbin's lawyer tried to stand again to object to explain, but the judge raised a hand. And in light of the falsified documents, this court will open an investigation into both Mr. Drexler and Mr. Maro for potential criminal liability. The gavel fell, sharp, final, court adjourned. For a beat the room held its breath. Then noise returned in whispers and movement. Corbin sat frozen, his hand still gripping the edge of the table as if the wood could anchor him to something solid. His knuckles were white, his lips pressed into a thin line, eyes flicking to me not with power but desperation. I rose slowly. This wasn't a moment for grandstanding, not a victory dance, just clarity. I didn't need to gloat. He knew. As I turned to walk out, I felt his gaze on my back. I didn't rush. Each step was deliberate, echoing across the floor like a punctuation mark. A quiet sentence written in steel. You lost. Outside the city was loud again. Horns, wind, a siren somewhere in the distance. But I stood still, letting the breeze hit my face, letting it wash away the heaviness that had clung to me for months. Savannah joined me a moment later. She didn't speak right away, just stood beside me, her presence grounding. Then she said, "He'll try something else, but it won't matter. He's spiraling." I nodded. "Let him spiral. I'm done playing his game." Later that night, the message came. "Unknown number. You think you're smart. You're going to regret this." I blocked it. No reply, no fear, just silence. He could throw words at a wall all he wanted, but the walls he once used to trap me had fallen on him. 3 weeks after the verdict, Corbin's world began to collapse. It started with whispers inside the financial district. Then the emails stopped. Then the board at his firm released a quiet statement. Mr. Corbin Drexler is no longer affiliated with Sterling & Co. He was dropped. Just like that. The man who once walked into rooms with certainty, who told me I'd never survive without him, was now desperately trying to sell his car, his condo in Tribeca, liquidate anything he could before the investigations caught up. He'd tried to take half of everything, and in the end, he lost all of it. I, on the other hand, had never felt so still. Not empty, not numb, just still. For the first time in months, I woke up in the morning without that crushing knot in my stomach. I drank my coffee while watching the sunrise, not the email inbox. I stepped outside without flinching when my phone buzzed. And I laughed again, real laughter, not the kind that hides behind politeness. It wasn't just about the money. It never was. It was about taking back the pieces of myself he tried to quietly chip away. The confidence, the clarity, the control. Savannah called it my second life. I just called it breathing again. One Friday evening, I walked into a rooftop bar where a group of close friends were already gathered. Beatrice, Savannah, Rachel, and 2 others who had stood by me in silence while the world had turned cold. The moment they saw me, someone clapped, then another, and then a toast was raised. To Isolde, Savannah said, lifting her glass. "The woman who proved that being quiet doesn't mean being weak. That strategy is louder than drama. And that when a man tries to bury her, he forgets she was the one holding the shovel." I smiled. Not wide, not loud, but full. Because she was right. I hadn't just survived Corbin's betrayal. I had buried it and walked away clean. Later that night, after the celebration faded and the city dimmed into soft yellow haze, I walked alone. The streets of Manhattan glowed beneath my heels, the lights reflecting off the wet pavement like stars scattered underfoot. The October air was crisp, brushing against my collarbones as I tightened my coat, not from cold, but from awareness. Presence. Beside me, Beatrice caught up and walked silently for a block before asking, "How does it feel, knowing he has nothing left?" I paused at the next corner, watching a cab splash past. Then I smiled quietly. "It's not revenge I feel," I said. "It's freedom." She didn't speak, just nodded. She understood. Because this wasn't about Corbin anymore. It wasn't about courtrooms, or trust accounts, or even winning. It was about the silence inside me finally being mine. No more flinching when a door creaked. No more pretending not to see lies printed in a smile. No more dimming myself to keep someone else's ego intact. I had walked through fire and shed everything that wasn't me on the other side. From now on, every decision, every dollar, every breath would be mine. Not shared, not stolen, not bargained. Mine. As we walked again, I whispered not to Beatrice, but to myself. He lost everything, and I found everything I needed. The wind picked up, the city kept glowing, and I kept walking into my own life. Some betrayals don't scream, they whisper, in late-night calls, in passwords changed, in eyes that no longer meet yours. I used to believe love meant surrender, that building a life with someone meant handing them the blueprints to everything, your dreams, your fears, your finances. I don't believe that anymore, because love should never cost you your self-preservation. Corbin thought I would freeze, that I'd unravel in silence, but silence is where I planned, where I built my escape, where I turned every wound into strategy. This wasn't about revenge. It was about remembering who I was before he tried to erase me. If there's one thing I learned, it's this: you can survive betrayal, but only if you protect yourself emotionally, legally, financially, especially as a woman, especially when the person sleeping beside you starts calling you liability behind your back. So if you're listening to this and you've ever felt that pit in your stomach that something is off, don't wait for proof to breathe. Start preparing. You don't need to announce your strength. You just need to own it. And when they think you're still in the dark, that's when you strike. What would you have done in Isolde's place? Let me know in the comments. And if you believe in quiet strength and fierce comebacks, subscribe to hear the next story on Sophia's Revenge Stories, where silence doesn't mean surrender,